In 2007, game designer Clint Hocking coined a term that will forever change how we analyze video games: Ludonarrative Dissonance. In his critique of BioShock, Hocking described the jarring disconnect between what the game teaches us through its mechanics, the Ludo part, and what it tells us through its story, the narrative part. This tension sits at the heart of many beloved games. Think about Nathan Drake, the charming protagonist of the Uncharted series. In cutscenes, he is portrayed as a witty, relatable adventurer with a moral compass, yet during gameplay, players control Drake as he murders hundreds of people without a second thought. The story tells us he is a good guy, but the gameplay makes us a mass murderer. This dissonance raises profound questions about the unique storytelling challenges in video games. As game narratives have become more sophisticated, the gap between what we do and what we are told has become more apparent. Today, we will explore this fascinating contradiction, how it happens, why it matters, and whether it's always a problem. What makes this topic so important is that it speaks to the rare nature of games as an art form. As Janet Murray argues in her seminal work Hamlet on the Holodeck, narrative in digital media requires new frameworks that account for player agency and procedural systems. The conversation about ludonarrative dissonance is really about the maturation of games as a storytelling medium. In this video, we'll examine classic examples of this dissonance, explore when designers have used it intentionally, celebrate games that achieve harmony between play and story, and look towards the future of narrative design. We'll draw on perspectives from game designers, academics, and critics to understand this complex phenomenon that shapes our gaming experience in subtle but powerful ways. So let's take this journey together, examining the moments when gameplay and story collide, and what happens when they don't. Before we dive deeper, let's establish what we mean by ludonarrative dissonance. The term combines ludology, the study of games and play, with narrative, the storytelling elements. When these two aspects contradict each other, dissonance occurs. In his influential work Half Real, Jesper Juhl explains that video games exist simultaneously as rule-based systems and fictional worlds. This dual nature creates fertile ground for contradiction. As players, we constantly navigate between following game rules and engaging with the story. Game studies scholar Gonzalo Frasca elaborates on this tension in his work Ludology's Love Stories 2, arguing that the interactive nature of games fundamentally changes how we should approach narrative analysis. Unlike passive media, games require player input, creating a collaborative storytelling process between the designer and the player. Philosopher Ian Bogost further complicates our understanding through his concept of procedural rhetoric, the idea that games make arguments through their rules and systems. When these procedural arguments contradict the explicit narrative, dissonance emerges. Game designers and theorists Salin and Zimmerman define meaningful play as occurring when the relationship between action and outcomes are discernible and integrated into the larger context of the game. Ludonarrative dissonance happens when this integration fails, when our actions as players seem disconnected from the world and the story of the game. It is important to note that this dissonance exists on a spectrum. As game studies professor Miguel Sicar suggests in his examination of game ethics, some disconnect between rules and fiction isn't often necessary for games to remain playable. This question is, how much dissonance is too much? Let's look at a framework for understanding different types of ludonarrative dissonance. The first one is mechanical dissonance, when gameplay system contradicts narrative elements. For example, unlimited lives in a game about permanent consequences. The second one is character dissonance. Player actions contradict established character traits. For example, a pacifist character who must kill to progress. The third one is tonal dissonance. The mood of gameplay differs from the narrative tone. For example, it is a serious war story with comical gameplay. The fourth example is ethical dissonance. Moral framework clash between the story and gameplay. For example, a game that punishes violence in the story but rewards in the play. Now that we established ludonarrative dissonance, let's examine some of the most prominent examples in gaming history. To understand ludonarrative dissonance in practice, let's analyze some gaming's most discussed examples. BioShock wasn't the first game to exhibit ludonarrative dissonance, but was the first to be formally analyzed through this lens. Set in the failed underwater utopia of Rupture, the game critiques Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy and the concepts of unchecked freedom. As Hocking notes in his analysis, BioShock's narrative rejects the objectivist utopia by showing its failure, while simultaneously its gameplay endorses objectivism by rewarding the player for making self-interested choices. When players harvest little sisters for maximum power rather than saving them, they act according to Rupture's philosophy, while the story condemns that mindset. Game studies scholar Robert Yang elaborates on this analysis, arguing that BioShock's dissonance serves its thematic exploration of free will and control. This perspective suggests that sometimes dissonance can be thematically significant rather than simply a design flaw. The Uncharted series presents some of the most frequently cited examples of ludonarrative dissonance. Nathan Drake, portrayed in cutscenes as a witty, relatively moral treasure hunter, transformed during gameplay into what critics have called a mass murderer. Amy Hennig, creative director for much of the series, has acknowledged this disconnect, explaining that the high enemy count is a concession to creating engaging gameplay experience. This highlights an important challenge. Mainstream action games often rely on combat as their core engagement loop, which can create narrative compromises. Ludologist and critic Luke Maciak points out that this Uncharted paradox emerges from trying to merge cinematic storytelling techniques with game design traditions from different genres. The result is a protagonist who behaves like an action movie hero in cutscenes, but like a video game avatar during gameplay. Later entries in the series attempted to address this criticism through more narrative justification for combat and greater character reflection on violence, demonstrating how awareness of ludonarrative dissonance can influence design evolution. The 2013 Tomb Raider reboot presents another fascinating case. Early in the game, Lara Croft experiences her first kill as a traumatic character-defining moment. She's portrayed as reluctant, horrified by the violence she forced to commit to survive. Yet minutes later, players are engaging in headshot-focused combat against dozens of enemies, with Lara exhibiting the competence and emotional detachment of a seasoned killer. Game studies professor Espen Arseth described this as cognitive dissonance by design, in his analysis of contemporary narrative games, suggesting that the players are expected to compartmentalize story movements from gameplay sessions. This dissonance is particularly jarring because the game explicitly frames itself as a character study about the psychological impact of survival and violence. By establishing this narrative premise, but failing to maintain it through gameplay, Tomb Raider undermines its own storytelling goals. The Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2 represents one of the most ambitious attempts to address ludonarrative dissonance in a mainstream action game. The game thematically centers on the cycle of violence and its devastating psychological costs. To reinforce this theme mechanically, enemies have names that companions call out when they are killed. They have relationships, personalities, and clear emotional responses to the player's violence. The game forces players to confront these consequences of the protagonist and, by extension, their own actions. Media scholar Kristin Jorgensen examines this approach in her work on ethical gameplay design. She notes how The Last of Us Part 2 attempts to create what she calls ethical friction, deliberately uncomfortable moments that make players question their actions. Despite these efforts, critics like Maddie Myers have pointed out that the game still fundamentally rewards skilled violence while narratively condemning it, creating what she described as mechanical ludonarrative contradiction. This highlights how deeply entrenched dissonance can be in certain game genres. These examples reveal a central challenge. As game narratives become more sophisticated, traditional gameplay conventions' contradictions become more apparent. But not all dissonance is accidental. Sometimes it is a deliberate artistic choice. While ludonarrative dissonance is often framed as a design problem, some developers have deliberately employed it as a narrative and thematic device. These games use the contradiction between play and story to communicate deeper meaning. The most famous example of intentional dissonance is Spec Ops: The Line. At first glance, it appears to be a conventional military shooter, but as the story progresses, it systematically undermines and criticizes the very conventions it employs. Lead designer Walt Williams has explicitly stated that this dissonance was intentional, creating what game critic Brendan Keogh calls critical dissonance, using the gap between the player expectation and game reality to deliver commentary on the genre and military intervention. The game's infamous white phosphorus sequence forces players to engage with the horror of their actions in a way most military shooters avoid. The dissonance peaks when the game begins directly questioning the players with loading screen messages like, "Do you feel like a hero yet?" Game philosopher Miguel Sicard analyzes Spec Ops as an example of ethical gameplay that uses procedural rhetoric to make players complicit in its critique. The game achieves its thematic goals by creating intentional friction between player action and the narrative consequences. Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid 2 employs ludonarrative dissonance in its postmodern reconstruction of sequel and player expectations. The game deliberately frustrates players by replacing the expected protagonist and gradually revealing that the player's agency is an illusion. Game studies scholar Cameron Konzelman examines how Metal Gear Solid 2 uses this approach to comment on information control and manipulation within the game world and in the relationship between game designers and players. The game's final act breaks the fourth wall entirely, with in-game characters directly addressing the player's expectations and desires. This intentional disruption of the game conventional relationship between gameplay and narrative serves the game's information control, legacy, and memory themes. Toby Fox's Undertale represents another deliberate use of ludonarrative mechanics as commentary. The gameplay explicitly acknowledges the dissonance in RPG conventions by questioning why players automatically kill monsters to gain experience points. By offering pacifist alternatives to traditional RPG combat and remembering player choices across playthroughs, Undertale creates what scholar Amanda Phillips calls ethical gameplay mirrors that reflect player behavior to them. This game creates meaningful consequences for following traditional gameplay incentives, grinding for XP that contradicts the narrative's moral framework. This isn't a design failure but a central thesis about player agency and responsibility. These examples demonstrate that ludonarrative dissonance, when employed thoughtfully, can be a powerful tool for commentary and reflection. Developers can prompt deeper engagement with themes and mechanics by deliberately contradicting what players do and what the game tells them. Having explored dissonance in depth, let's turn to its opposite, ludonarrative harmony. Games can achieve a uniquely powerful form of storytelling unavailable to other media when gameplay and narrative align to communicate the same ideas. That game company's journey achieves remarkable harmony between its mechanic and themes. The game is about a pilgrimage, and every aspect of gameplay reinforces this metaphorical journey. The mechanics of movement, surfing down sand dunes, struggling against wind, flying briefly with limited energy, all directly communicate the emotional arc of Journey. The multiplayer mechanics, where players can help each other but cannot communicate beyond musical chimes, reinforces themes of connection beyond language. Game designer and researcher Robin Hunicke, who served as a producer on Journey, has discussed how the team deliberately aligned mechanics with emotional goals, creating what she terms dynamic difficulty adjustment based on emotional metrics rather than challenge metrics. Valve's Portal achieves near-perfect ludonarrative harmony by making the portal gun the central gameplay mechanic and the narrative focus. The story is about testing this device, and players experience that story directly through using it. The game's antagonist, GLaDOS, serves as narrative guide and gameplay director. Her instructions and threats are both story elements and actually gameplay guidance. When she begins to subvert testing protocols in the story, this is reflected in the level design that requires breaking the established rules. Game critic Ian Bogost notes that Portal exemplifies what he calls procedural rhetoric at its finest. The game's argument is made through its systems as much as its explicit narrative. From Software Dark Souls series achieves harmony between gameplay and narrative by embracing difficulty as a thematic element. The repeated death and respawning of the player character is narratively justified as the undead curse within the game world. The obscure, fragmented storytelling mirrors the gameplay experience of piecing together, understanding through exploration and discoveries. As game designer Daniel Veda argues in his analysis of Dark Souls' narrative architecture, the act of reading the game world is integrated with the act of playing in it. The game's multiplayer elements, messages left by other players, ghostly glimpses of their actions, invasions, all reinforce the narrative theme of parallel world brushing against each other in a dying universe. Zome's Disco Elysium achieves remarkable ludonarrative harmony by making the protagonist's fragmented psyche a narrative focus and a gameplay system. The skills that govern success in checks are personified as aspects of the character's personality that directly address him, and by extension, the player. When the character faces trauma or psychological challenges in the narrative, this is reflected in mechanical penalties to certain skills. Conversely, narrative growth enables new gameplay options. The integrated design creates what game's narrative designer Emily Short described as psychological complexity as gameplay. The game's amnesia premise elegantly solves a common RPG problem. It makes sense narratively and mechanically that the player is defining the character's personality as they play, rather than being a ludonarrative convenience. These examples of harmony demonstrate that when developers approach mechanics as expressive elements rather than merely systems for engagement, games can achieve a uniquely cohesive form of storytelling. The question isn't whether gameplay and narrative can work together, but how to design from the beginning with this integration in mind. As games evolve as a storytelling medium, how might developers address the challenge of ludonarrative dissonance going forward? Let's explore some emerging approaches and possibilities. Rather than seeing story and gameplay as separate elements that must be reconciled, some developers are embracing what game designer Warren Spector calls systemic storytelling, creating rich simulation systems that generate narrative moments through player interaction. Games like Dishonored, Hitman, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild create narrative experiences through interlocking systems rather than scripted sequences. When a player's improvised solution to a challenge feels consistent with the game world and character, dissonance diminishes. Another approach is developing what narrative designer Adrian Hon calls narrative mechanics, gameplay systems that directly express story elements rather than existing alongside them. Games like Heaven's Vault build translation machines directly connecting to the archaeological narratives. Return of the Obra Dinn uses deductive reasoning as its core gameplay and narrative drive. These games don't separate story and gameplay into distinct elements that might contradict each other. Many developers are addressing dissonance by giving players greater expressive agency within the narrative. Games like Disco Elysium, Mass Effect, and Kentucky Route Zero allow players to define their character's personality and motivations, helping align players' actions with narrative characterization. Game scholar and designer Mary Flanagan examines how this approach creates critical play spaces where players can explore complicated ethical and personal questions through mechanically supported choices. Perhaps the most promising developments come from independent developers who aren't constrained by traditional gameplay expectations. Games like What Remains of Edith Finch, Before Your Eyes, and Unpacking tell stories through unique mechanical metaphors rather than adapting conventional gameplay systems. These games are free to design mechanics specifically to support their narratives rather than filling stories or unexpected gameplay genres. Game researcher Brie Code describes this as designing from emotional core rather than mechanical core. A significant part of ludonarrative dissonance stems from players' expectations and gaming conventions. As critic Lee Alexander notes, players have been trained to expect certain mechanics in certain genres, creating pressure to include elements that may not serve the story. As gaming literacy evolves and players become more accepting of diverse gameplay experiences, developers gain more freedom to align systems with their narrative goals rather than genre expectations. The future of narrative design likely lies not in eliminating ludonarrative dissonance, but in making more conscious choices about when and why dissonance occurs. By understanding the relationship between systems and stories, developers can create more cohesive, meaningful experiences, whether harmonious or intentionally dissonant. Ludonarrative dissonance isn't simply a design flaw. It is a fascinating window into the unique storytelling challenges and opportunities that games present as an interactive medium. When Nathan Drake quips about treasure hunting between firefights, when Lara Croft transforms from traumatized survivor to efficient killer, when the game asks us to care about violence in cutscenes but reward in its gameplay, these moments reveal the growing pains of medium finding its narrative voice. The most interesting question isn't whether dissonance is good or bad, but how awareness of relationship between play and story can lead to more thoughtful design. As game designer Frank Lantz suggests, the friction between what we do and what we are told can be meaningful, a space for reflection on the medium itself. As players' understanding ludonarrative dissonance enriches our experience, helping us to appreciate both the constraints developers work within their artistic choices. It gives us a vocabulary to discuss what works, what doesn't, and why. And for developers, this awareness opens new possibilities. Deliberate dissonance as commentary, harmonic integration of systems and stories, or entirely new approaches that we haven't imagined yet. The conversation about ludonarrative dissonance isn't about finding a singular solution. It is about recognizing that relationship between play and story is a creative space full of potential. In this tension between doing and being told, games have found a unique expressive power available to no other medium. As games continue to evolve as a storytelling medium, the most exciting possibilities lie not in eliminating dissonance but in understanding when it serves a purpose and when harmony better achieves a game's goals. The space between play and story isn't a problem to solve. It is a defining characteristic of gaming as an art form.